Welcome to the Pop Cult Podcast. Here are your hosts Ariana and Seth.
This is the Pop Cult Podcast. I'm Seth.
I'm Ariana.
And today we'll be looking at two more new releases. A little later, we're going to be looking at the very grounded slice of life drama, Ghostlight. But first, we're going to look at the very stylized, very personal, hyper real. I didn't know if I was ever going to see this movie or get to see this movie, The People's Joker. A law-breaking comedian who is grappling with her gender identity forms a new anti-comedy troupe with a friend and finds herself battling a fascistic caped crusader. This is clearly a very, very much a passion project of Vera Drew. And Ariana, I'm going to share some information with you.
Go right
And
ahead.
our audience, if they'd like to listen along. So before we recorded this, I was like, I really want to know a lot about who is Vera Drew, because it's such a personal movie. I needed to know that to understand and kind of contextualize it. So this started as just a creative re-edit of Joker.
Okay.
Drew is an editor by trade, and I'm going to get into what she has edited, which will make a lot of sense.
Right.
And someone approached Vera Drew about re-editing Joker for fun. And as Drew started editing that film, she started to see connections between her own life and the characters in the film. Comedy, mommy issues, and then ultimately gender for her, which I don't really think that's present, really.
No.
Though he does imagine a woman that he falls in love with, who that means she would be him, right? That's who he kisses, right? So then Vera decided to do the even more insane thing of not just re-editing Joker, to re-edit every single Batman film into a single movie about her own gender discovery, but that proved to be too ambitious. And I think it has to do with, clearly the film doesn't hide her love of the Joel Schumacher Batman movies. So it was going to just be a parody film of Batman movies and has become now a coming of age story, which is such a strange transformation. So her journey with this film is, she has never said who. She has said a media conglomerate tried to pressure her to pull the film from festival circuits. There was no cease and desist because I don't think they could legally stop her. And she will not say who it is. And somebody reached out to Warner Discovery because they're like, well, the DC properties are owned by Warner. Warner said they would neither confirm or deny the thing. So neither of them will say.
Okay.
It's a very weird thing. So Vera Drew, once I started to find out what she had been involved with, a lot about the style of this movie made sense. And if you haven't seen this movie, it is a very overstimulated style.
Yes.
A lot of backgrounds that are just green screened. And she learned that by working on Cinema at the Cinema.
Okay.
Tim and Eric's Bedtime Stories.
Okay.
Check It Out with Steve Brule. Comedy Bang Bang. I Think You Should Leave. Nathan For You. The Birthday Boys. So as I read this, the more and more I just love Vera Drew, because I'm like, oh, everything she's worked on is stuff that I have, in terms of comedy in the last couple decades or so, I've loved. It's been my favorite comedy. And she's been responsible for editing a lot of that. She refers to Tim Heidecker as her showbiz dad. Because he did some Q&As in LA and constantly kept checking in with her, going like, how are you doing? Because he knows how much the media stuff has been, asking her lots of questions. So she sees this film as being the end point of the Adult Swim aesthetic. Which was kind of dominated the last 20 years. And she compared it to how a lot of critics have said that Natural Born Killers marked the end of a certain 80s, 90s aesthetic. And you just never really saw that being used again.
That makes perfect sense.
Because it was just sort of Oliver Stone. Well, because it was that screenplay was written by Quentin Tarantino. So it's the end of that era, it's the beginning of a new era kind of thing. And this film kind of feels like that in that the techniques used to make it, the sense of humor is all very much what has kind of dominated pop culture for millennials, Zoomers kind of for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And I like the idea of this is the end of that. This is all of it kind of brought to a big culmination. Now, of course, it's not like Adult Swim is shutting down.
No.
They're going to keep trying to squeeze what they can out of that. But it really, when I think of where something like an Adult Swim needs to go, I think of like a Joe Pera. Go to 180, something totally different. And I think she does an interesting job of presenting us with something familiar, but by the end of the movie, it becomes a totally different experience.
Yes.
So I've done a lot of talking, giving background, and introducing you to who Vera Drew is, so you kind of understand artistically where she's coming from. Talk to me about what you thought of the movie.
Well, this movie, it's hard not to correlate it closely to I saw the glow of the TV.
I saw the TV, yeah, I love how we're forgetting. Hey, we're old people. It's that movie about the trans children. I saw the TV glow.
Where it's
very personal.
Very personal, but it's also this thing of it being realizing that because your personal experiences have not been reflected back at you, you almost have to write a fiction version where you fit yourself into that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where somewhere that you can say, well, this character was trans or this character was gay, or no, I'm going to change like the race of this character in order to reflect what I'm seeing so I don't feel alone in this world.
And I would even say this isn't even really the Joker. This is like a whole other story.
Yes,
it's like names changed to protect people, kind of almost. Yeah.
And like also in ways where they're not being subtle about it, which I kind of enjoyed. When every time I heard about this film, I thought it was going to be chaotic. I thought it was not going. It
was going to be messy and annoying
because you, for example, you love like Tim and Eric.
Yeah.
And I never really fell in love with them. I can also
understand like Tim and Eric. There's a reason why Awesome Show, Great Job was a 15-minute show. Because it's a lot. It's the same thing with I Think You Should Leave. If you turned I Think You Should Leave into a 30 or 45-minute show, it would not be as beloved.
Well, I think it also like Tim and Eric has a lot of gross out humor, right?
A lot of body horror humor, yeah.
And this, it was like at the end when you remove the fact that there's like this veneer of a Batman story, right? Quote unquote.
Which is barely a Batman story.
It is so touching and so raw that it makes sense why somebody would have to be like, I have to code it in comedy. I have to like
it'd be too much
in this.
I have to call them characters from Batman, because if I just presented this as it happened, it would be devastating.
Yeah, it would basically just cutting out your own personal wound and then asking people to look at it.
Yeah. And so the hyper animated stuff, the overstimulated aesthetic is there kind of to protect the viewer. Yeah. And to protect Vera, to go, we're all going to create this artificial distance between us and what's happening so that we can tell the story and not have like a nervous breakdown telling it.
Exactly. And it's this very interesting thing of like how the character is going and just being like, one of the raw things was being like, I just want one happy memory of my childhood. Just one. And it had like, and it also had to be like a happy memory between the main character and their mother.
Yeah.
Because the father is obviously absent.
They don't even have anyone playing the father.
It's just like the father's working, but it has to do.
But the whole thing is the father is uncomfortable with the child.
Yes.
Because that's a very common thing that happens.
It is heartbreaking when you think about it, because it is a child that is wanting to connect with a woman and basically wanting to be like, I want to be like you.
Because she relates to the mother, but the mother sees it as her son.
Yeah, but it's like this also awfulness of it being like, I want to be like you, but you hurt me.
Mm-hmm.
You hurt me by not seeing me. And it's also like there's this beautiful line when like um the character finally meets their partner and like
Who's the Jared Leto Joker, which I loved the fact that we had multiple Jokers.
Yes.
Well, because Vera Drew's Joker, it wants to be a Harlequin.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. And so what we're doing is it's Joker and Harlequin, I feel like are being used as stand-ins for comedian or comedian, the way that like the feminized version of comedian.
Yeah.
So it's Vera Drew thinks she's supposed to be a Joker, but inside she wants to be a Harlequin.
Yes.
And
then it's also the remarking at the fact that the Harlequins are just there to show their tits and be hot.
Well, let's get into the comedy showbiz part of this movie, which I thought, oh wow, I would love to know what certain people in Hollywood, especially in the comedy scene, thought of this movie and what it was saying. Because Saturday Night Live is presented as UCB Live. And if you're listening to this podcast and you're not familiar with what UCB is, it stands for the Upright Citizens Brigade, which started as a comedy troupe out of Second City. It included members like Amy Poehler is probably the most well-known member.
Yeah.
Horatio Sands was part of it. Matt Walsh, who was on Veep, was part of it. And it was very successful in that they got a 3-season Comedy Central series, which I remember watching early in my college years, because I think it got canceled maybe my freshman or sophomore year. And that along with like Strangers with Candy, that was like they were on a hour block, I think, on Fridays.
Yeah.
And it was like I was like, I love this. This is my aesthetic. Since then, the members of Upright Citizens Brigade have gone on to different levels of fame. But one thing, Matt Besser, a founding member, has been very big into like wanting to spread improv. They were very influenced by Del Close, who, if you look him up, is kind of seen as like the grandfather of American improv. He also came out of Second City and was a contemporary with people like Mike Nichols and Elaine May. They were all around the same age doing improv in Chicago. So Matt Besser decides to follow in that tradition, and he starts the UCB Theater, and they end up with, I knew there was a UCB Theater in LA, and there was one in New York, and there might have been maybe some others. I don't know, but it was
like Chicago.
It was like Second City, right? Where there's like a Second City Toronto, there's a Second City Chicago. And they have really came to dominate the comedy scene in the 2010s, especially. I think because of COVID, they used that as not an excuse, but it kind of was the final nail in the coffin. And the UCB business seems to have been shuttered, from what I know. I'm not as much of an insider, but it seems like they had to close the theaters. They weren't making the level of money that they needed to. But from what people who went to they took lessons at a UCB theater, or they became part of a troupe that performed there. Not everyone agrees, but there seems to be a growing number of people who were very dissatisfied with UCB. They saw it as catering to a very specific comedic aesthetic, which I think is Matt Besser's comedic aesthetic.
Which is white boy rocker.
Or I believe he's Jewish.
Yes.
And there is this kind of like, I guess the Yiddish kvetching, right? Where you whine or complain about something. And that can work. Like you look at Larry David. He's made that like an art form where it makes it where it works. There's something, it's very Gen X about Besser in like the worst ways. This kind of constant cynicism.
Well, like it's his attitude always seemed like, I'm a punk rocker and this is what we need
When
to be like.
There's definitely a superiority complex.
Yes.
He thinks he's better than everyone.
He thinks he's better than everyone, and then he also like, well, I was bullied as a kid. And
it's like, well, you're not a kid anymore. You're an adult. Grow up. And so it was seen as like UCB, clearly from Vera Drew's point of view, came to kind of dominate what comedy could be defined as.
Yes.
So before she can join UCB Live, she has to go to this UCB training school, which is essentially the UCB theaters. And she has a very particular perspective on comedy, a way she likes to do things, but that's at odds with the method of the school. And that method of the school is represented through, of all people, who I was not expecting to see in a movie, David Liebehart as Raja Ghul. So once again, if you're unfamiliar, you should just look up some Tim and Eric stuff. Look for like puppets.
Yeah.
David Liebehart hosted a cable access show, I think somewhere in Los Angeles, maybe. And his thing was like Christian ministry with puppets. But he is clearly a neurodivergent person who is also very creative. But his style of creativity almost comes off a little nightmarish sometimes,
Yeah.
which I think is what drew Tim and Eric to him. And so one of the complaints you often see about Tim and Eric from people who don't get the aesthetic is, oh, they're exploiting these people. And I would argue that's not true. I would say I think what Tim and Eric like to do is they like to take people who don't often get the spotlight and give them the spotlight. And they get to be their weird selves. And I think Tim respects the hell out of David Liebehart. He's not laughing at David Liebehart. He thinks David Liebehart is genuinely a funny person.
And I think
And he is.
like the fact that they've been working for like
over a decade
together does not mean exploitation.
Yeah. And I think there's this thing, and it's what Vera Drew's kind of pointing out through the film, is that Western media, specifically US media, has this thing of trying to hide others. They have an aesthetic, which is what we talk about, the Joker and the Harlequin, right? The Harlequin is just a hot girl. And if you think about like SNL the last few years, there have been women who have a certain aesthetic, and I don't doubt that they are like, I don't think they're not talented. Oh, that very tall woman that's on the show. I don't know the cast members anymore, but I think she cracked up during the Beavis and Butthead sketch. You know who I'm talking about? I can't think of her name because I just don't really watch SNL. Heidi something?
Yeah.
I think she's funny, but I also understand why she got cast on that show. Same thing with like Chloe Fineman.
It's like average pretty to the point that all like pretty enough, but not too pretty.
Because there's a difference between them and a Rachel Dratch. And
or an Adie Bryant.
Yeah, or even a Tina Fey.
Yeah.
Right? Where there's this kind of aesthetic, this clinical way that SNL has been pruned and shaped so that it never really had an edge. There's people who like to act like SNL was
there's certain cases that obviously do better with certain wigs. Like Tina Fey was not one that, like, if you
she was characters,
you could see her, it's immediately her
Weekend Update.
Like Weekend Update.
I thought Rachel Dratch is one of my favorite SNL cast members of all time.
Yeah, and
I think she was so funny.
The stuff that, for example, I seen Adie Brandt and her show, which was it was a Hulu show that on the side that she had.
It was like Obnoxious. It was something like that, right? It had like a one-word title.
Yeah.
Abrasive.
Yeah, which is great. We're doing a podcast about media. We can't
read
any of the media.
Well, it's a podcast about good media, not trash, gutter, streaming stuff. Okay, continue.
But like, she was one of those that's like, she's not the aesthetic, and she's funny. And then when they leave, they're kind of like, you feel that absent, and then they're like trying to fill it up again with the same sort of like, let's get a chubby girl in there, or let's get. And
you can tell like what Vera's sense of humor is based on the people she casts in small parts. Bob Odenkirk, Scott Aukerman, Maria Bamford. Like, there's some other people that you might not like recognize because you're not a nerd like I am, but like you probably don't even know those names. But like, it's like an alternative to the alternative.
Yes.
So it's this very specific, weird kind of comedy, which is kind of in the film. It's anti-comedy, right? Mm-hmm. Where we're kind of making fun of the aesthetics and structures around comedy and how we all have this media trained expectation of setup punchline. And that's what Tim and Eric were doing, where we're like, how far can we go in this direction until you just cannot handle it anymore? Or how far can we go in this direction? Or what if we juxtapose this thing with this thing? And neither of these are very funny, but if we put them together, is there anything funny in that? And so it feels like a truly experimental type of comedy where you really are trying to figure out like what makes something funny. Did you think that The People's Joker worked as a comedy?
I think it works as a comedy in plenty of times. I
can remember there were two places where you like gut busting laugh. Okay. I can't remember what the jokes were.
Great.
But well, I mean, because it's such a rapid fire movie.
Yeah.
Like you were saying, it's so overstimulating, but still in like a very weird, touching way. Like it's It feels very much like an internet aesthetic.
I think one of the parts that got me was this is before the character realizes that they're trans, but they're right on that edge, and so they're going to the like, and they're being scanned. They're like, "Why do you need to know my name?" So they're being scanned, and suddenly their genitalia is being scanned, and it's just like
Male.
like
Yes.
male, like 5 inches below average. And it's like, oh, okay. It's like suitable, meaning like it was like that'll be great because it means like you'll still feel inferior enough that we'll be able to do certain things to you.
Because it's Maria Bamford is the voice of Lorne Michaels, who is a CG character in this movie.
The part that got to me was when they're just like, oh, well, finally she transitions, they offer her stuff, but it was also having to do the fact of how much money they have to pay to just be
To
there.
the classes, because once you take this class, you have to take that class.
And that cracked me up because of how many times I've heard how like people who do improv are paying for these classes, and how I've heard about other improv people who did only 1 or 2 classes and decided, fuck this, I'm not paying for this. It's like
So I want to read you a quote from Vera Drew about SNL.
Okay.
Because she's talked about, found an interview with her, and she talked about how she has friends that are on the show, like Sarah Sherman is a very good friend of hers and is in this movie.
Yeah.
In some tiny little part. I think she does the voice of Poison Ivy, I think.
Okay.
So this is what Vera Drew said about SNL. I don't think SNL is the worst thing that we have in America, but it's just part of the fear industrial complex of just keeping everybody scared and everybody really respectful of rich people.
Yeah, that really hits it on the head. Like,
well, because you think about in recent years, they've had Elon Musk and Donald Trump both host on that fucking show. And back when I was a kid, I remember Bob Dole and Steve Forbes hosting.
well,
Like, this is disgusting.
I think it kind of fits this idea that how America is, and especially with certain cultures, like they're losing their identity. This idea, like, well, if you were punk, you looked this way, and you had this idea, and now everyone is just trading and swapping fashions to the point that you're like, oh, that person has blue hair, they must be a liberal, and it turns out they're fucking conservative, like
far right wing.
Yeah. And
What's
so like your like the aesthetics are okay, they're pleasing to the eye, and they're okay. But if you're gay or if you're trans,
that's
but you know, it's okay. We're still gonna nitpick on all the little subcultures.
Well, it's appropriation is what
Yes.
you're basically describing. It's how everything has always worked in the United States. And something like Black people have had a front seat view of is there is no culture in a white society because whiteness is an absence of culture. It's a rejection of your ethnicity to be part of this blank superiority in quotation marks that is so superior it has to keep borrowing from people who still have an acknowledgement of their ethnicity to create any kind of art. And so what we have here is Vera Drew kind of pointing that out through her movie a little bit, because this is so, the aesthetic is what I would consider white culture. Just overstimulated, deep fried, oversaturated, chaotic hell.
Yeah, and I think she pinpoints it very well, especially because once the character goes viral with her rant, right? And Lauren Michaels is like, we want you to host a show. It'll be great. You'll host a show. But once they go, yeah, I'll host the show, they're like, actually, you can't be wearing women's clothing. Can you like not talk about blah, blah, blah? But you know, it's going to be great. You're going to bring so many ratings.
Because they want that rant.
Yeah.
It reminded me a lot, and I'm sure Vera Drew's seen this movie and probably was borrowing for that Network.
Yes.
Where we have Howard Beale, who has a very organic rant, which comes out mainly from the fact that he's about to be fired because he's old. And he has this unhinged rant, which is just the ravings of a very reactionary old man. But it does well in the ratings. So then the network decides, yeah, keep doing that. So it takes anything that might have been authentic about this complaint and just turns it into another commodity, another thing that can be packaged and sold. And so what it's a very clever thing that capitalism does, because it's a way of how it defangs legitimate critique by absorbing the critique. We see it through the use of therapeutic language, through the use of identity politics language, and how American capitalism and media have become very adept at saying things the right way. You look at something like Disney is just one of the worst examples of it. And then giving money to people who are actively wanting to commit genocide against like trans and queer people.
I mean, it is this fucked up thing when you think about it, how people will categorize themselves into different things by what they like to buy and what they like to use,
What they like to stream.
and what they like to stream. So it's sort of like how there was a part like in media that I remember that people were like, oh, if you're a Swiftie, you really you'll like Mitski, and like,
which is a weird,
which was like people were like saying when they went to her concerts, they were reacting to her like she was a like Taylor Swift, like screaming in the middle of her sets,
and that's not her vibe.
That's upsetting for her.
It just makes me think of Lord, the video from her concerts where she's just telling us, "Shut up, I'm singing. I don't want you to sing along. This is not karaoke."
But it is also like, because we're such a thing of consuming, we forget the artistry behind it. And I think this was so hyper done to the point that like,
but then there's a moment of catharsis,
yes,
right? Which sticks with you.
Yes.
Then that's like that's the big emotional moment of the movie, right? And that's Vera Drew's representing like psychologically what was going inside of her, where she finally is, this is who I am.
Mm-hmm.
It also reminded me of Guy Debord, who made me sound such a pretentious asshole. But I read one of his books. I'm going to say read. I'm not going to say I fully understood everything in it, because a good text like that, you're going to have to come back to. But it was the Society of the Spectacle that he wrote back in the 60s. And he talks a lot about identity being tied in with consumption, and the result being a type of loneliness that is new to what at the time was the 20th century, and I think it's continued on to the 21st century, that it is the loneliness of the crowd, where you're amongst a sea of people, yet you feel as if you're completely isolated. And I know that's something I have felt on numerous occasions.
Yeah.
And you've probably felt that at some point. And people listening have probably felt that. And that's not like a natural thing, I don't think, at least to the intensity that we feel it in society now. It's something that probably exists in people, but has been agitated by the way culture is designed. And like we see it in this movie, and Vera can only present her identity to you through the lens of this pop culture figure that you know. Mm-hmm. Because to just present it as Vera Drew, it would overwhelm you, and you wouldn't want to sit and watch it because it would be too real.
It would be too uncomfortable. It would be maybe you thinking about the times that you might have disregarded a friend trying to come out to you, which there were scenes like that. Mm-hmm. Like before it becomes really like hyper into the colorful, there are scenes of Vera trying to come out to a friend, and then the friend being like, I can't take this.
Coming out as trans.
Yeah. Or like even close to anything being gay or within that realm. And the same happens when Vera is a child and trying to explain to the mom what's going on, and the mom takes them to go to therapy. And
the Smilex, the drug that they get.
The drugs. And then wondering why it is that they don't have a relationship while, Vera's taking the drugs in order to not cause any problems.
Well, and then the bit that Vera does, and it's one of those where I'm not sure if I fully understand the context of what that's meant to represent. But the bit that she becomes famous for is someone coming on stage telling about what happened in their life and how sad it is, and Vera huffing Smilex and then laughing hysterically.
Yeah.
And part of me thinks like, is that kind of like a comment on just internet culture, right? The way everybody's on display and the way people kind of gain reputations by ragging on or roasting people online. And then that kind of gives you prominence.
I think it's a mixture of both, of coming out wanting to reveal, like explain something that deeply hurt you, and then someone in the comments just roasting you.
Yeah.
Or being like, what are you talking about? There's people like out here who have it worse than
Well, it's
you.
like she becomes a troll in order to protect herself.
Yes.
And then eventually people get tired of that because punching down can only work for so long.
Yeah.
And then it becomes like, well, who are you then? And it turns out the saddest story is Vera's story, which she's been using other people's sad stories to hide behind, essentially. And then she goes through her transformation. I would say what I found interesting was I had never planned on watching this movie.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons why is I went, oh, that's like, and it's one of the things where you think like, oh, I'm not transphobic, but you realize like, oh, there's some internalized transphobia. Maybe, kind of. But it was more like, I just thought, oh, I won't understand that movie. I think that's what my brain was thinking, is because it's this, I kept saying it's this very personal story about this trans woman and her journey and all of this. And I think in my brain, in the back of my head, was like, and I saw the aesthetic too. I don't like Joker. So that probably was one of the reasons too. And I just thought, oh, I think this is going to be something that I just can't understand. It's just not for me. So I'll probably just pass it over. And then thankfully, there's some movies we've been trying to watch that it just seem fucking impossible to get a hold of. So I looked at like, well, what was out there and what was getting a good review? And I saw this, and I had heard a review on Film Spotting that was very positive of it. I was like, okay, we'll watch it. And I'm so very glad I did. And now that I like know more about Vera Drew's background, I'm like, oh yes, of course. Like the things she worked on are things that I go back to. Oh, I found this. She was essentially the showrunner, and this is a show I don't think anyone listening to our podcast is going to know. Beef House.
Beef House?
Tim and Eric sitcom.
Oh!
She was like, I ran that show. I edited it.
God.
And she said, I think it's a brilliant show. And she said, it's not available to stream anywhere. Like, they pulled it off of Max.
Yeah, it was like such a weird,
and
bizarre
it is like a deconstruction of the American sitcom.
Yeah.
And it is disgusting.
Yeah.
Because the one episode and it has a fucking meadow soprano in it, which I always thought was crazy. They got her as Tim's wife.
Yeah.
But it was the episode where I think it was she's Eric's wife. Yeah, and she's a cop.
No,
but it was Tim is single. And it was the episode where he has diarrhea and he gets in the hot tub with the sexy neighbor, and they attach a hose to him. So when he has his diarrhea, like it's a very Tim and Eric thing.
Yeah.
And so when I read that, I thought, oh, I love Vera Drew even more. Like, yes, I feel like I would get along perfectly with this person. Very parasocial to say, right? But it also made me go, oh yeah, like in future, if I see something is very much about like a trans experience and maybe an aesthetic that I'm kind of like iffy about, I need to not go, I'm not gonna watch that. Watch it. It's probably gonna be good.
You might end up having more compassion and empathy for these people, but for other people who are going through something that is like, again, it's so vulnerable when you really get into it.
And that's it. People are gonna see like images from this, and they're gonna have the completely wrong view of what this movie is. Even if they just watch the opening of it, they're not gonna understand what this movie is.
Like, there are lines that are fucking poetic in this film.
Like, I would not be surprised if there were people like in theaters bawling watching this movie. But because one movie I immediately thought of was Stress Positions, which we watched recently, and I wanted to watch that because John Early was in it. And it turned out it was written and directed by and starred its creator, Theda Hamill, who is a trans woman. And I hated that fucking movie.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it did feel like it was true to who Theda Hamill is, right? I guess. Yeah. And so it was just, but it also didn't feel like it was trying to share anything.
No.
Or like, there's something earnest about The People's Joker. I think the way it was made by someone without any pretense. Well, and Stress Positions was made by someone who's incredibly pretentious.
Yes, because I think about like the vulnerability of The People's Joker and the lines that she delivers, where she's like, so I cannot believe you are the first person who really saw me. or when
the abusive Jared Leto partner
Yeah.
and the shit that happens in that relationship.
like with the moment that she tells like it's like, oh, I wish I could have been your happy ending. It was like, I was like, but you were my happy beginning and I needed that more. Like there are fucking words in here like that are just so beautifully done. And like the funny thing that the Jared Leto like Joker thing, you could have left feeling a bad taste in your mouth for that character having no, but
Yeah,
he makes you
it's
feel
so
empathetic.
even-handed.
Yeah,
She doesn't judge anyone in this movie, even her own mother,
like
who's very mean to her.
like the gaslighting, like
Yeah.
that was such a fucking like brilliant way. I loved the way that it was filmed. I love the way it was represented, that it worked within the reality that we're seeing it. But like the way that they acted, I love the fact that even though like she's supposed to be like the Harley Quinn character, she doesn't try to adopt like the accent.
Yeah, she's not trying to be
like,
she's not trying to be Margot Robbie or anything.
Like I'm just gonna do what I can with this, and it's like I thought it was great.
Would you recommend The People's Joker to our audience?
Yes,
I would too. I'd say this may not be a kind of movie a lot of you might normally sit down and watch, and you might sit down and watch it and be like, what the fuck did they get me to watch? But I think if you stick with it and you really pay attention to what Vera's saying, there is a tremendously good film here. When a construction worker joins a local theater's production of Romeo and Juliet, the drama on stage starts to mirror his own life. This is our review of Ghostlight, a film directed by Alex Thompson and Kelly O'Sullivan, written by O'Sullivan. And there was a little fact I wanted to read about what Ghostlight is. So the title of this movie, Ghostlight, refers to a theatrical tradition that calls for a single bulb to remain lit on a stage, even when the rest of the theater is literally and figuratively dark. The origins of this tradition are unknown. It may have emerged from basic safety concerns, but since theater has numerous superstitions, many of obscure origins, it may be only or primarily a symbol for luck. Some members of the general public were first introduced to this tradition when theaters worldwide were forced to close during COVID. And so there was a lot of articles about like theaters putting on the ghost light until they were able to resume production. So, initial thoughts about Ghostlight before we get into some details about it.
I thought it was a touching movie. I did like the fact that we don't know what is happening in this family life. You kind of have to go through actually paying attention,
Yeah,
before you figure out what is wrong.
Yeah. So Kelly O'Sullivan, I've never seen any of her work, and apparently she won like I think it's like the John Cassavetes Award for like independent filmmaker for her first feature. And so this is her follow-up, if I'm correct. One of the things that I think is very interesting about this movie is that Keith Kupferfer, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that name correctly, who plays Dan, he's our main character, the construction worker, stars alongside his daughter Catherine, who plays his daughter in the movie Daisy, and alongside his wife Tara, who plays his wife Sharon in the movie. So these three people who we spend most of the movie with are a real family. The film also has Dali De Leon, who I recognized immediately from Triangle of Sadness. She does a great job there. She's a Filipino actress. I'm sure she's played many other parts that I have yet to see. Hopefully I'll see those because I think she's very good.
Yeah.
So what did you think of the performances? Because this is a movie about performance. So that's what we're going to be drawn to immediately is these acting performances.
So obviously the older actors were solid.
Yeah.
All of them good. Daisy has a little bit of a rough patch.
I think she's 16-ish
Yeah,
in real
I
life.
don't
Yeah.
buy her as this hard kid. I think like
Yeah.
just being a smart ass.
Well, because the way it's set up is there's a trauma that we don't know about, right?
Yes.
And I think the trauma is supposed to be informing her behavior,
Yes.
but you are right, and that she reads as a Broadway kid.
Mm-hmm.
And even her character, Daisy, is very interested in theater and the stage, and she loves acting. And that just, I guess we have maybe a preconceived notion of what a theater kid is and what they aren't.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't see theater children as rebellious. They seem to be kind of, I think of like, they love Aaron Sorkin, right? Like, because the theater people I know, having gone to university, and some of my teachers love Aaron Sorkin. And I just have associated theater of a certain kind, like a certain, official American theater.
Yeah,
It's a certain
there's always
thing,
a
yeah.
mix between like the ones that love Aaron Sorkin and then the ones that like love D&D.
Yeah.
Like there's that division. I think with Daisy, it's a little bit rough, acting wise because
She's a kid.
she's a kid, but
She still has moments.
yeah, she has great
Because it's one of
moments.
those where it's not the entire film, but there are scenes where that actress just gets it. Like she understands what the scene's about and she delivers.
Yeah. As for Keith,
As Dan, completely believable.
yeah.
100%. You believe this guy is a construction worker. He has the look. And I think we were talking earlier off mic. We try not to do that very often.
We
But
don't talk to
because
each
I was
other.
trying to figure out like why does his performance work and his daughter's doesn't the whole way through the movie. It works in some moments. And I think it's because with age, he's in his 50s and he has lived long enough and is an observant enough actor. And because he's had all that time, he knows how to subtract from his performance and boil it down to like a few key things and then
Mhm.
just let the humanity of the character come through.
I think it's also this understanding of the difference between stage acting and
Film.
film acting. He allows the silences to be filled out by the audience of what his thoughts could be. There's like this pensiveness that he's going about. There's a heaviness.
You can feel there's a lot going on in his head.
Yes.
Even though he doesn't have to exposit it. It's through his body language. The things he does say tell us about things he's not saying.
Mm-hmm.
And so just masterful acting on his part. I'm wondering like what other things he's been in.
Yeah.
What did you think of Tara Mallon, his wife, as Sharon?
I thought she did a great job. She's not on screen as much as everyone else. I was pleasantly surprised, especially to find out, oh, she's also another theater actress.
The post deposition for me was like nailed that
Yes.
scene. Like all of this stuff that comes flooding out of her at him because it's clear he's the one who's been pushing for a lawsuit. He's the one who like wants retribution of some kind for what happened to their family. And she's been going along. And like in the way she speaks, it's clear she would have been fine if they didn't do any of this. But he wanted to do it. So she said, okay, let's do it. Only for him to have his moment of catharsis during a deposition after they've spent thousands of dollars with lawyers and all of this for mediation. And I think those emotions felt very real from her. And that was one of the things that I did like about this movie was the realness of this movie. And there's moments where it does get a little too heightened for my taste. The character of Jim, I think it is, who's the actor that keeps getting usurped. He's playing Romeo, and then he loses the role of Romeo, so he's playing Mercutio, and then that he loses that role. And that felt kind of cartoonish or sitcom-y a little bit, a little silly.
Supposed to like filling up that comedy element of the film.
And it wasn't too much, so I'm not that annoyed about it. It's also a film about age.
Yes.
What did you think about how it talked about age and the way it kind of took, because the play is Romeo and Juliet, and you want to talk about how they flip our expectations with age in that regard?
So Dan obviously comes in complete newbie. He does not. It's supposed.
He's been fired from his job.
He's been fired. No, he's on a leave of absence.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Not fired. Leave of absence
Because he had like a physical outburst, right?
Yes, and what it's supposed to be that like basically Rita sees this outburst and approaches him about being in the play, and the way she kind of wins him over is just saying, "You look like someone who would rather not be themselves for a couple of hours," which, hey, that's how you would sell tabletop role play to me. That's how you
like, and it's an interesting way of framing acting.
Yeah.
Is, do you just want to be someone else and all your problems are gone for like while you're doing your performance?
It is like how she's playing Juliet. There's
complaints about her playing Juliet.
By the guy who's originally playing
Romeo.
She's too old, and she is just, this is the role she's wanted to play her entire life.
Well, and also they're all old. It's it's like a community theater, and they don't have many young people.
Yeah, and they're just like, she's the best actress. We're gonna go with her. And it is this thing of it just wanting to achieve this dream while knowing that like life is passing you by. It's also this weird thing of trying to explain to people there's like that suspense of disbelief when you're on stage. It's not as if you're up close to the person seeing every fine line. But I did like the switch of going, well, Dan should play Romeo then. And it should be two older people, and there's like no complaints.
Well, and it adds a totally different context to Romeo and Juliet when they're being played by people in their 50s.
Yeah.
Like, it adds a poignancy to it. Like,
because I think you can look back on that age about being reckless, and
there's like a world weariness that you don't associate with Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah.
And makes it a more interesting performance.
It makes it interesting because Rita has to argue with Dan about the performance. He's just like, I can't play Romeo. This is stupid. Why would they do this? And she's like, you're not supposed to think about the actions. You're supposed to think about his emotions. On how you're going through the emotions, on how you're acting on those emotions, even if it's not the right decision, because that is a part of being young.
Because once again, you're not yourself.
Yeah.
You need to stop thinking as yourself and think of the character. What would they do?
Yeah.
Which is why good acting is really hard, because there's plenty of people that can read lines, but there's very few people that can really, you forget it's them. And those are people who are so incredibly talented.
I think it's similar to when we've heard and read about good writing, about not trying to think about what your decisions would be, or trying to be as vulnerable as possible without thinking about the audience.
It's releasing judgment.
Yes.
I'm not judging the character. I am just relating what the character does. And I am making it as authentic and true as possible. What did you think of Dolly De Leon as Rita?
I thought she was great. I really liked how earnest it was. I think it felt very realistic. It felt like she was this character, and she understood the sacrifices this person had done.
But like, in a way, she is, right? I assume Rita's a Filipino woman.
Yeah,
and Dolly's a Filipino woman, and they're both actors, and they've struggled, and they
explained that Rita had been like in New York for like 18 years,
and just never made it big, quote unquote.
Like, went back home and decided to continue acting beyond just her full-time job, because it's like she missed it. It was something that she wanted to do. And it's that interesting thing of like when she's sharing a story with Daisy, and Daisy goes, I'm younger than that. Like, you've been in the city for 18 years in New York. Like, and how she plans to go to New York, and how
she sells that well, Kath, that actress, as the teenager who has these kind of big lofty dreams about how she's going to make it. And then, Rita serves as kind of a foil to that. She's the other side of, she went and it just didn't work out, but she's still following acting because it wasn't about becoming a Broadway star. It was about the craft. It was about doing the thing. we're not gonna go into any details about the trauma because that's just part of watching the movie, right? Is you have to watch the movie and as it's revealed to you through dialogue. I do want to talk about the method of revealing that because in other more clunky Hollywood type movies, they would kind of tell you right up front, or they would show you a thing like they'd show you a picture or they'd show you some signifier to immediately tell you what was going on.
Yeah.
And because the family's trauma is enveloped in the dialogue of the film, again, it reflects back on the performance. You have to be able to deliver that dialogue in a way that feels authentic to the characters experiencing it and how each of the three family members is in a different place with this trauma.
Yeah. And I also like the fact that because we have to discover it through the dialogues that they have with different people, it is not like, oh, exposition time between me and my daughter.
It's very organic.
There are things happening in their life that like you're just like, okay, at so and so time we're calling this office. Yeah, I need you available for that time. Okay, cool. I will be available during that time. Or hey, and Daisy going, can I participate? And you're like, listening, going like, what is going on?
Well, and then like Sharon's laying down rocks around a tree outside their house, and Dan shows up and freaks out.
Yeah,
and you're immediately like, okay, something happened in that place, but he doesn't do the thing you would get in a Hollywood movie, which you'd go, Sharon, blah, 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 which is not the way people talk, right?
Yeah.
They know. They don't need to say it out loud. And it's something so painful they wouldn't want, like, that's part of it, right? For Dan, is he won't say it out loud. And so it's a film that, like, when it was over, that was one of the interesting parts, is the way this movie ends is not like you would expect this movie to end. Because when the credits come up, the movie's still going on.
Yeah.
And the play is over, and Rita's like, oh, we'll try to do a comedy next time. Something like not as heavy. Mm-hmm. And Dan and Sharon and Daisy go home, and they go inside, and they just keep living.
Yeah.
And then eventually the film goes to black. But I thought that was such a fascinating way of ending the film, to show like, yeah, people just keep living. You have moments where you maybe have catharsis or you understand something, but like most movies, they just kind of end at that moment instead of going, oh yeah, and then you have to get up and you have to go home. Yeah. And then you have to make dinner. And then you have to like go to bed, and then you have to wake up and you have to go to work. Like, and it just keeps going. That was one of the things where I just love when media does that. I was thinking of like The Sopranos as very different, very melodramatic, but had a similar kind of, that just has to end at some point.
Yeah.
Like, we just have to end because we could keep telling this family story forever because it's never going to end, because Daisy's going to grow up. She'll probably maybe have kids. Maybe she'll adopt kids. Or maybe there'll be a neighbor and their kids become like grandkids to Dan and Sharon. And it's just going to keep going forever.
Or it's like, oh, they continue doing plays together. Like, Daisy graduates from to go to college, or like all these changes that can occur. And the thing is, like, what happens to them will be ripple effects that happens through their life, but it's just the impact won't be as hard as it was as the moment that the big splash occurred.
Yeah, because at the core, this movie is about them saying out loud what happened and then moving through it, and not like forgetting it, but remembering, like, right? So this film also featured Alma Washington, who played I can't remember the character's name, but the mother, the ailing mother in The Bear.
Oh, yeah.
And then she was also in one of my favorite shows that we mentioned earlier in this podcast. She played Lulu Gibson in Joe Pera Talks With You, the wife of Joe's neighbor.
Yeah. And his best friend.
And that made me think of, this feels like a drama taking place in the Joe Pera universe.
Yeah, that would make total sense. It's kind of cozy. It
keeps it real.
Yeah.
Now they listed as a comedy drama. And I would say there are funny moments, but not enough that I would call it
Yeah.
a comedy. I would say it's more of it's like slice of life drama.
Yeah.
The characters are being presented with real world problems. There's places where it could lean into melodrama, but it refuses to go there. And it grounds what's happening in a reality that we can relate to, that feels like I've met people like this, or I guarantee you there's people going through this, like in the United States right now.
Yeah.
It also reminded me of a film we reviewed last week, Janet Planet, in terms of the similar aesthetic, where it's kind of pared down. We're getting rid of anything that's unnecessary.
Yeah.
It's still being presented with style, but the style is not like, we compare this to like The People's Joker. Ghostlight is, we're not letting the style dominate the screen. The style exists to complement the performance. So by muting elements of that style or shaping them in a certain way, it is all to highlight Keith Kupfer playing Dan.
Yeah.
So we're not going to get in his way. If we do extreme close-ups, it's because we realize that's the moment where we needed a close-up, because that makes his performance better. Not because I'm a director and I want to achieve a certain thing and I don't give a damn about what the actors are doing, kind of a thing. And so this is a movie where I didn't really write a lot of notes about it. But I did wonder, and I have a feeling there's probably a lot of improvisation in this film, is what I'm going to guess. Yet it's still, Kelly O'Sullivan is listed as the writer. But I get the sense just from the way it was made, there was a lot of asking the actors what they thought and getting their input and making it a collaboration rather than like this dictatorial auteur coming in.
Probably be like, this is the scene that I want X to happen. Now go ahead.
Well, it's kind of like Cassavetes. In his work, it was, or a Mike Leigh movie, where it's their movie, but even they would go, well, this is a product of all of us, right? Like, if, Peter Falk hadn't been in this movie, it would have been a different movie.
Yeah.
If Gina Rowlands hadn't been in this movie, it would have been a different movie. And so those specific people in those specific roles shaped the direction of the film.
Yeah, and there's also there's something lovely about the fact that Dan, as the father, is going to Daisy, his youngest daughter, for advice about this.
Because she's into theater and he's not.
Because, like, so, for example, he hasn't revealed to her yet what he's been doing, but he's like, how did he memorize all those lines? And she's like, well, you have to find the rhythm of it. So...
Well, and this is the first time where I was like, oh, I get it. Shakespeare, the rhyme is not for you to say, it's for you to memorize.
Yes. And then how she's like, she also explains how it feels to do romance in a play, how she kind of flirted with a boy in a play, but she's like, it was just part of the play.
But even she kind of got caught up in it and had to remind herself, like, but you aren't these people.
Yeah, and she's like, the thing is, like, once the play was over, I realized I didn't like that kid at all. I liked when he played this character, and that's pretend, and that's okay.
Well, and then the whole intimacy coordinator scene.
Yeah.
Which is something you'll hear talked a lot about, but I think most of us wouldn't know what an intimacy coordinator, we assume like, oh, they're just on set when they do a sex scene to go like, oh, you can't do that. Don't do that. And that's not what it is at all. It's about getting the two actors comfortable enough with each other so when the intimate moment happens, it doesn't read as like fake.
Yeah.
And so it's they used to do like in Hollywood chemistry tests, and I guess they maybe still do those, where they'll have like an actor read with another actor and they want to see like, do these people gel? And that's like the first step of an intimacy process, is do they feel like they're talking to each other naturally, I think. Mm-hmm. And then what we see here is the sort of the physicality of that performance. How can I like touch you in a way that isn't like explicitly sexual, but by holding your hand, we're communicating to the audience a relationship.
Yeah, and I think it's also this interesting thing of, by watching this film about like that had to do about acting and getting someone who isn't an actor participate in acting, when he pairs up with another actor and they're like, say something like that is going to surprise them or out of norm, and then like they have to be like, all right, you say what expression you see on their face, but they have to say what expression they're feeling.
Yeah.
As like shocked or embarrassed, and how Dan is kind of like actually naming his emotions and being surprised by those emotions and being able to connect to those emotions, especially when he later on was like, well, I always thought my children were dramatic. And it's like this thing is like, no, you weren't able to label your emotions to go through them.
Well, what's interesting is this does kind of pair with The People's Joker, and they're both films about performance and identity and how these two and trauma, right? And so while they're both aesthetically different ends of the spectrum, I have a feeling that like Vera Drew and Kelly O'Sullivan would probably get along fantastically. And that's a conversation I would love to see, because they both approach the form from very different places, but understand that the goal is authenticity in the performance. That if I don't believe you, I'm not going to care about what you're trying to say.
Because like they do exercises where they're supposed to feel silly and ridiculous, but it's supposed to make you feel comfortable enough on stage to not care.
It's vulnerability.
And so the same can be done with The People's Joker. It is doused in this like silliness, but also like colorfulness in order to deal with the fact that there's so much vulnerability there.
Would you recommend Ghostlight? We've been very cryptic about aspects of it, which is kind of the movie itself is a cryptic movie. I would. I think if you are someone who right now in the theater as of this recording, I think like Alien Romulus is like the big box office hit of the weekend. And as someone who thinks the first Alien film is like a masterpiece, and I really enjoy Aliens, and some of the other films are okay, I just am done with that kind of a movie. I just don't have it in me to sit for 2 hours and just watch people get eviscerated without any sort of underlying purpose. Where it's murder is entertainment. When it's like, I have no problem with violence in a film, but it needs to serve a purpose beyond like grossing me out for like chuckles. And so if you're someone who wants a film that comes from a very human place, that feels like it's speaking about life as it is right now, about people who are not wealthy, it's not aspirational in the way that term is used very often, that is just a very grounded film about the human experience and being hurt, I would say yes, Ghostlight is very much worth your time. And I would say because of those older actors, it's one of those things as I get older, I think I enjoy old actors performing more, because they just bring a lot of like realness to the performance. It feels like they're there. Well, that was the Pop Cult Podcast for this week. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to check our show notes for all the important links, including to our website, popcult.blog. Make sure that you subscribe wherever it is you listen to podcasts so you'll be notified when our new episodes are up. If you visit popcult.blog right now, you're going to find a lot more reviews. We've just wrapped up a series looking at films dealing with the atomic bombing of Japan. We're going to be finishing that up this week with the recently released Godzilla -1. From there, we're going to be doing a short series to end August, which is dipping into more of the Sight and Sound best films list that came out last year. And we'll be kicking that off by publishing reviews of Max Ophuls' Earrings of Madame De and the Czechoslovakian experimental farce Daisies. If you enjoy what we do here on the podcast and over at popcult.blog, we'd encourage you to support us on Patreon. We've got different tiers for you to pick from depending on what's most comfortable for you, and we're appreciative for whatever you can give. I want to thank our current patrons, Becca and Matt. They both donate at the writer's room level, and at that level, you get to pick a movie that we will watch and review every month. We also have available to all subscription tiers, patron-exclusive podcast series. They're little mini-series we like to do. Right now, we've been recording and stockpiling episodes for our Love at First Laugh, which is going to be a 6-part series looking at romantic comedies from the 1940s up to the present. On next week's episode of the Pop Cult Podcast, we're going back to watch a movie I have never seen in honor of its what looks to be a very bad remake coming out. We're going to be looking at 1994's The Crow, as well as the refugee drama Green Border. Until next time, you keep listening, we'll keep watching.